Great to see you all. Really looking forward to this this talk today, and hearing from Ishtiaque Ahmed, who's one of our faculty fellows at Schwartz Reisman. Ishtiaque is also an assistant professor of computer science here at U of T and director of the Third Space Research Group. Received his PhD and master's from Cornell and his bachelor's from BUET in Bangladesh. BUET, let's see, Bangladesh University.
Engineering and Technology.
Okay, there we go. Also a graduate faculty member at the School of the Environment and a senior fellow at Massey College. Co-organizes the monthly critical computing seminar at U of T. That sounds like something great to be joining. And co-steers U of T's Sustainable Development Goal Initiative. Ishtiaque's research focuses on the design challenges around strengthening the voices of marginalized communities around the world. And one of the reasons I'm so excited about this work, expanding us, conducted ethnography and built technologies with many underprivileged communities in Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, Iran, Iraq, Turkey, China, Canada, and the US. Received the International Fulbright Science and Technology Fellowship, Fulbright Centennial Fellowship, and of course, our fellowship here at Schwartz Reisman. We just are jumping on the bandwagon of people who are excited about Ishtiaque's work. Research has been funded by all three branches of Canada's Tri-Council Research Institutes, the NSF, the NIH, Google, Microsoft, Facebook, Intel, Samsung, the World Bank, UNICEF, and UNDP, among others. So Ishtiaque, you just represent the kind of interdisciplinarity that we are trying to drive at Schwartz Reisman, and so pleased to have you with us. Now I'll turn it over to Ishtiaque, who's going to talk to us about whose intelligence, whose ethics, ethical pluralism, and decolonizing AI.
Thanks, Jillian, for kind introduction. Let me try to share my screen for my presentation. I hope you all can see my screen now.
Yep, we got it.
All right, thank you. So, hi everyone, welcome to my talk today. I'm thrilled to be able to virtually join you and to have this opportunity to present my research before you. The title of my today's talk is Whose Intelligence, Whose Ethics? Ethical Pluralism in Decolonizing AI. So as Jillian also mentioned, I'm an assistant professor in computer science department. I have also affiliated with the School of Environment here and very recently Faculty of Information. And I'm a Schwartz Reisman Institute faculty fellow. I did my PhD and master's from computer science. And before that, before moving to North America, I did my bachelor and master's in computer science from Bangladesh University of Engineering and Technology. Now I'm a Bangladeshi. I was born and raised in Bangladesh. And then after my undergrad and master's, I moved to North America. So now I would like to share with you the background of my research, a bit of my journey. I grew up in Bangladesh in 1990s. While growing up, I found many computing technologies were coming into the country, including desktop computers, mobile phones, dial-up internet, among others. This continued even in the early 2000s when we saw technologies like broadband internet, smartphones, tablet computers, smartwatches, social media, and different sharing economy applications kept coming to the country. I saw that these technologies were bringing several notable changes to the lives of the local people in Bangladesh. I kept asking to myself if those changes were actually desired by the local communities or they were imposed on them. More often than not, I found that the computer technologies were not addressing the main challenges that the local people had in their lives. So when I grew up, I set my goal to understand the needs of the underserved populations there and to work with them to improve the quality of their life with the help of technology. With this in my mind, I developed the first ever human-computer interaction research group in Bangladesh with a few bright undergraduate students from BUET in 2009. In the last 12 years with this group and other collaborators around the world, I have started different marginalized communities in Bangladesh, India, and many other countries and addressing their problems and designing technologies with them. These communities included ready-made garments workers, taxi drivers, evicted slum dwellers, mobile phone repairers, victims of sexual harassment, among others. While conducting my research with these communities, first I tried to understand the research challenges in people's lives by studying their culture, politics, economy, and history. And then I built computing technologies with them that are accessible, inclusive, robust, low cost, and secure. So in short, my research methodology is a combination of ethnography and computing. Through these research methods, I try to address the central theme of my research, which is voice. Let me explain to you first what I mean by voice and why is voice important for marginalized communities. To answer this question, let us first think about the world we live in. We often call this world the world of data and information. For many of us, we get information when we open a newspaper or turn on television, radio, or switch to social media. All of these sources can be thought as platforms of voice where we learn about the stories and opinions of various communities. These and other similar platforms are often used for harvesting data, and we, the computer scientists, use this data for developing computational models and AI algorithms. However, how many of us ever thought that these platforms do not represent the actual data, information, opinions, and thoughts of various marginalized communities? For example, it is almost impossible to find the thoughts of millions of illiterate people on these platforms because they either do not read or write or they do not use these digital technologies. Similarly, we don't hear the voice of millions of victims of sexual harassment on these platforms because talking about sexual harassment is often stigmatized. Then millions of factory workers around the world don't feel safe to share their thoughts because they fear of losing their jobs. Similarly, millions of refugees do not freely speak on these social media platforms because their identities are not secured and protected. Thus, our digital platforms and other methods of collecting data lack the representation of this and many such marginalized communities' voices. In other words, we say that our digital platforms are biased. Now, I define this as a comprehensive socio-technical process for these communities for obtaining freedom from this marginalization. This voice for me is not only the final product, but also the entire process that gives the community the necessary freedom to stand for their concerns. My research tries to understand where, when, and how this process of voice is hampered, stopped, and people are silenced, and how we can design socio-technical arrangement with these communities to overcome these challenges. The objective of my research frequently leads me to various relevant research questions, including how can technology be accessible to all? How can we achieve social freedom over technology? How can we make an infrastructure inclusive and sustainable? Or how can we make people's voice heard? And it's just to mention a few. So I have been addressing these questions of access, autonomy, and justification in my research for the last 12 years. Today, I will briefly describe my projects on access and autonomy before talking about my more recent projects on justification, which concerns AI. When I started thinking about voice, the first thought that I had in my mind was that 1 out of every 5 people in the world cannot read and write. And there are many others who are semi-literate or many are digitally illiterate. This is one major barrier for them to access the digital platforms and share their thoughts. I looked into the existing research on making computing technologies accessible to low literate populations, and I found that scholars had made great efforts by making the interface more accessible for low literate users by adding graphics and audio interfaces. While each of these efforts made some success, they all failed after a certain point. And as those interfaces demanded the low literate users to remember graphics and audio clues, which was not possible for them after a certain limit. I realized that most efforts in making a computing interface was either depending on the user's cognitive ability or the ability of the interface to help the user's cognition. However, my living experience in Bangladesh told me that the use of mobile phone is often shared in that part of the world, and targeting a single user for the use of technology might be not appropriate for the local communities. Having this in my mind, I conducted a 6-month-long ethnography with a group of illiterate rickshaw drivers in a rickshaw garage in Kamrangichor area in Dhaka, Bangladesh in 2012. These rickshaw drivers were illiterate, but they all were using mobile phones. In this ethnography, my objective was to learn how they were able to use their phones and what challenges they might have in using such computing technologies. Soon I found that the rickshaw drivers would take help from their garage owners, who was a literate person and was willing to help the drivers in using their phones. Soon I also found some other such smart members in their communities who were literate and were helping the illiterate rickshaw drivers use their phones. This model of help matched well with the gift-giving theories in the classical anthropology, especially with the work of Marcel Mauss. But there were challenges too. From our fieldwork, we also learned that illiterate drivers would struggle to use this gift when the helping hands were not around them. For example, at night when they were at home with their families or when they were away from their garage in the daytime. To address this problem, and based on the gift-giving theory of Marcel Mauss and the lessons from my fieldwork, I co-designed a mobile phone application for the rickshaw drivers that would allow them to take help from the garage owner remotely. We used graph matching algorithm to find the most suitable matches and to distribute the load of helping. The implementation was based on text messages, as the use of internet was not common within that community, and because we wanted to keep the cost low. We deployed the prototype with 12 participants for 6 weeks as the pilot, and then with 60 participants for 6 months as a longitudinal study. In both cases, we found that the users found ease and comfort in using our system, and it contributed to making their community bond stronger. We reflected on our work on access in this project and took a few important lessons for the marginalized groups in Global South. Number one is that modern computing design is often built on Western assumptions, for example, individual use, that is not applicable in places outside the Western world. This lesson is aligned with the theory of post-colonial computing by Lily Rani, Kavita Philip, and their colleagues. Second, when we look at a problem from a Western perspective, we often miss the local resources like community bonds that can be very important and essential design resources for people in the Global South. This lesson is aligned with the theory of asset-based design by Kentaro Toyama, Neha Kumar, and their colleagues. In summary, any design effort for helping access to computing should be rooted in the local social context. However, only access is not enough. While it is important to make technologies accessible for all, it never ensures the voice of marginalized groups over computing platforms. We need something more. Many people have technical access to computing systems, for example, and they can read and write, but they are not free to express their thoughts despite having the technical access to computing. Their voice is curtailed by the society. This is why the next important step for me was to understand the voice from a perspective of freedom or autonomy. To explore these challenges with autonomy, I turned to the problem of sexual harassment in Bangladesh. Like most other countries in the world, sexual harassment is also a serious problem in Bangladesh. Thousands of incidents of sexual harassment are reported each year to the police. However, as the social scientists found, most incidents of sexual harassment remain unreported. Especially women do not want to talk about this because this topic is stigmatized in the community. Many of these women are rich and educated. They have access to modern computing technologies, and they know how to complain over social media. However, they often remain silent because of the overwhelming social pressure. I wanted to find the root of this silence. With a group of female researchers in Bangladesh, our team spent more than 1 year to conduct anonymous surveys, interviews, and focus group discussions with the women who suffered from sexual harassment. Several participants told us that almost all the women in Bangladesh have experiences of direct or indirect sexual harassment, but very few of them actually talk about it. And it was evident even in our data collection process. We could only conduct 11 interviews in the whole 1 year, even after advertising it widely. Some women registered for the interview and then canceled the appointment. Some came but then decided not to talk. Some bursted into tears in the middle of the interview and then left. Some completed the interview and then called us and asked us to delete the interview. It was evident from our research team that the silence around sexual harassment was not easy for them to break. The few interviews and FGDs that we could finally completed gave us some important insights into this problem. For example, we could learn that the women wanted help at the spot. They wanted to quickly reach out to their friends and family when needed, and the victims often felt better after sharing their stories with others. However, the main problem that we found through our study was silence. Social stigma, fear, shame, and pain silenced these women. In response, we developed a mobile phone application that would allow women to report a sexual harassment, ask for help at the spot, and instantly reach out to their friends and families. We also developed a website where women could report the incidents that they experienced or observed. We are visualizing the reports over a live map of the city. They would also share their thoughts in a form of blog anonymously. We would share the reports and blogs over a Facebook page to create more awareness and invite dialogues. We called this system Pratibadi. This is a Bangla word that means one who protests. We launched this system publicly in 2013. Soon after launching, we started to get thousands of reports each day where women anonymously reported various kinds of harassments, from inappropriate touch to catcall, and from verbal abuse to serious forms of physical torture. This project was highlighted in many national and international media outlets, including BBC and New Scientist. However, at the same time, we also observed that the anonymous reports were attacked by many men and women on social media. These people started to blame the victims. For example, the screenshot here shows an anonymous report by a woman who was catcalled on the street as she did not cover her head. She felt abused and reported about that on Pratibadi. However, when the anonymous report was published, many men and women started to blame the victim, saying she was asking for it because she was not covering her head. Similar incidents started to happen more frequently over Pratibadi, and we saw a decline in reporting. At one point, the rate of reporting went down so low that we decided to close the system. This was an important lesson for me on how the voice of marginalized groups like women is silenced by the society. I further noticed that the main mechanism of this silencing is ethics. For example, in this case, the crowd used a version of Islamic ethics to silence the victim. Similarly, in some other cases, we found that people were using Western neoliberal feminist ethics to blame women who choose to live a life of a homemaker. So I started asking this question: who determines what is right and what is wrong on a computing platform? How ethics can be used as a tool for silencing marginalized groups, and how can we strengthen the voice of marginalized communities by establishing their ethics in and over computational platforms? These questions allowed me to explore the growing scholarship within computer science around ethics in computing, more specifically ethics in AI. I found that scholars in the Western world have been criticizing the modern computer science and its various applications for either purposefully supporting or for making the way for various unethical activities. Let us explore some of those concerns. Among various concerns of unethical use of computing systems, privacy breaching is a leading concern. Various AI algorithms and other computing applications are found to be capturing sensitive private information of the users and using them to gain profit. Even worse, in many cases, such data are used to manipulate people's political orientation. Among many, Susanna Zuboff's work, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, explains the problem in detail and shows how private data often works as the fuel of data-driven capitalism. Another important concern that has been expressed by scholars is the biases in computing systems, especially in the data-driven systems. Scholars like Ruha Benjamin and Virginia Eubanks have explained how various practices around data reflect the historical biases in the society, and hence data-driven systems are often biased against marginalized groups of the society. If we look deeper into these two and many such ethical concerns that have been voiced by the scholars in the West, we see how they are rooted in some ethical standards that are commonly accepted in the West. Many of these concerns are underpinned by the faith in secularism, democracy, nationalism, liberalism, and free market economy, for example. As a result, the associated scholarship has been successful in determining problems with racism, sexism, ageism, ableism, and colonialism, among others. However, there are many other ethical concerns that can be associated with computing and AI systems that have not been surfaced through this process. For example, the caste problem in India needs to be understood from the local history, philosophy, and ethics. Similarly, the concerns of many Muslims around the world in the use of human-like robots needs to be understood from Islamic philosophy and associated ethics. Such ethical concerns are rarely voiced in the discourse of ethical computing in the West. I want to shed some light on this issue. Let us try to understand this issue better by two stories from Bangladesh. The first one is taken from a recent paper by Christensen and his colleagues. They wrote about a weather prediction technology that they deployed in rural Bangladesh to help the farmers. Let me read a paragraph directly from their paper. The village mosque lies at the center of village life, metaphorically as well as physically. It is the spiritual, moral, and religious epicenter of the village. Therefore, it was a blow to the project that the local imam, after consideration, disallowed NGO staff's use of the mosque PA system as a means to broadcast messages. The local imam did not approve of the announcement of the messages such as weather forecast and associated agricultural advice stemming from the service in this mosque. The reason given by the imam was theological, only Allah knows. The field officer assigned from the local NGO to the village comes every 5 days or so and was hoping to announce some messages and forecast to the villagers using the mosque. Select messages on, for example, extreme weather predictions such as drought or flooding that may be considered important and even vital for the welfare of the village. And the NGO officer was hoping in the process to promote the service and the work of the NGO. A few messages were mic'd in the mosque to use the expression of the NGO officer before this practice was discontinued. So as we can see here, the local community believes that only the God can predict the future, and any attempt to do so by humans or machines is considered challenging the God and hence unethical according to their faith. The ethical concern of the local villagers were coming from an ethical standpoint that is hardly taken seriously in the ethics of AI or ethics in computing research. If we take it further deeper, many of today's ethics in computing and ethics in AI are built on a secular and empiricist philosophy that is not aligned with the spiritual nature of ethics in many faith-based communities around the world. The second story is coming from an ongoing fieldwork by my PhD student, Muhammad Rifat Rashiduzzaman, who has been studying the use of social media by the faith-based communities in Bangladesh, especially the practicing Muslims there. In this project, we have been studying why many practicing Muslims were not using modern online social media like Facebook. So this is what Rifat wrote in his field notebook in February 2020. He wrote, "In our fieldwork, we found religious Muslim people were not using Facebook. We asked them why. One of them explained they do not like the AI algorithm of Facebook. We wanted to know more. He said it is very unpredictable for him. He does not know what will come up next to his newsfeed. What if he ends up seeing or reading something that he is not supposed to see or do? This uncertainty makes him avoid using Facebook or any other social media." So now, as we can see here, many members of this practicing Muslim community are not comfortable with the uncertainty of what can come to their newsfeed next. Facebook's AI algorithm brings to one's newsfeed the news and post that Facebook seems find relevant and interesting for the user. However, these users are not comfortable with allowing a third party to find for them what they will see. Since they are not quite sure what they will see is permissible for them to see, they consider using Facebook unethical or risky. We note again that such ethical concerns are often not discussed in the Western discourse around ethics in AI or ethics in computing. These and many other stories from our fieldwork and a rich body of work in political philosophy, anthropology, social sciences, and theology help us understand why the idea of a generalized and ubiquitous ethics is both wrong and problematic. More importantly, taking an ethical standard from one context and applying that on another context is a classical mechanism of silencing people. This kind of imposition of foreign ethics was a common tendency in colonial period as evidenced in the history. As a result, many knowledges and practices of the people of the colonized lands were called illegitimate, unethical, or substandard. This is why we turn to the idea of justification that underpins the voice of marginalized population. Building on the definition of justice given by the Nobel laureate Indian economist and philosopher Amartya Sen, we define justification both as an instrumental and constitutive mechanism that validates one's action based on their social and communal rights and their reasons to achieving freedom. Hence, for a computing system to be just, it requires to be justified through the local norms and practices and needs to prove how that is helping the local communities to achieve their freedom. Now we ask, how can design be just for a traditional community? In the rest of my presentation, I will describe 3 stories from our ongoing project in rural Bangladesh to highlight 3 important aspects of ethical design with the local communities, which are often missing in the design of computing systems, especially AI systems. These 3 aspects are ecology, identity, and hope. This project is being led by my collaborator, Sharifa Sultana, who was born and raised in Jashore in Bangladesh, where our field site is. She is currently a PhD student at the Information Science Department of Cornell University and also a Facebook fellow. For the last 3 years, we have been studying how people in 6 villages in rural Bangladesh, a district in southwest Bangladesh, interact with modern science and computer technologies and how those impact their well-being practices. In the last 3 years, we have documented more than 50 cases of witchcraft practices, production of more than 25 kinds of local arts, and local practices of betting and gambling. During this time, we conducted more than 300 interviews, more than 20 focus group discussions, and taken more than 1,000 photographs. At the same time, we also conducted more than 10 sessions of participatory designs with the villagers for solving local problems. We have been working with the support of local NGOs, political leaders, and local police, among others. And some of the findings of our ongoing study has already been published in Science CSCW in the last few years. If you are interested to know details about our work, I would recommend you read the full versions of these papers. Let us first check some of the basic information about the 6 villages that we studied. 80% of the population in those villages are Muslims, 19% were Hindus, 65% of the local population is engaged in farming. Jashore is famous for producing rice, cotton, lentil, and jute. Around 20% of the villagers are fishermen, and the rest are engaged in various other professions, including pottery, weaving, and small businesses. The average monthly income for a family is 5,000 Bangladeshi taka, which is equivalent to 59 US dollars. Various recent reports show that these villages are increasingly suffering from landlessness, poverty, crimes, and migration to cities. Over the course of our fieldwork, we explored the villagers' dependency on witchcraft for their well-being. We found that they consult the witches for various troubles, which broadly include legal problems, natural disasters, family financial crisis, and physical and mental health problems. Furthermore, the mental health patients are almost always treated by the witches in these villages. We found several reasons that influence the villagers to choose witchcraft over other means of support. First, the villagers mentioned that for hundreds of years, their ancestors held witchcraft in high regard for spiritual well-being. We heard of frightening stories of local myths where various strange and extra-human entities known as jinn, food, evil spirits, where they attempted to harm mankind and by taking the control over their minds. The villagers also shared their concerns regarding the limitations of modern medical practices and challenging spiritual situations. They believe that doctors or medical counselors cure the physical and physiological problems on a surface level, but they fail to deal with their underlying causes. Witches, on the other hand, are more trusted than educated professionals because they gain deeper understanding of the context using spiritual lenses. A typical investigation, witchcraft investigation process involves 6 steps. In the first step, the witch tries to identify the problem. This means why someone is feeling bad. Is that just a physical pain or something deeper? For example, do they have mental anxieties? Step 2 is to find out the reason for this pain. This investigation is very deep and connected to their faith. For example, if someone has a pain in their hand, a surface level cause for their pain could be a broken hand or a fracture in the bone, but a deeper question is why that misfortune happened to that person, or in other words, why some evil spirit cursed them with such a pain. This investigation goes into inquiring that person's moral history in the society. The witch often asks the person to visit a medical doctor to fix the physical problem, but the witch, then they for the moral and social issues, the person needs to perform certain tasks, which is step 3 and 5. I didn't go to the detail of these steps, which you can find in the paper, but the important part is that the witch makes sure the integration of physical and social is correctly done by connecting this patient with both scientific and religious scholars. Now, besides helping the villagers with their physical and mental health problems, these witches utilize their power to fight various social norms, including misogyny, radical religious rules, and health-related stigmas and taboos. In our fieldwork, we noted at least 7 cases where the witches, acting as the marriage counselor, engaged the female members of the union councils and the police to save female clients from their in-laws who had tortured them or starved them, demanded dowry, etc. These incidents highlight how witches justify their work by local value system and in parallel work toward the freedom of their villagers. We find that this is aligned with the definition of justice that Amartya Sen has given in that work, which is not based on scientific rationality, but is justified by the local people, by their local well-being. So thus we see the rural understanding of intelligence. So as the rural people, they consider the witches as the most intelligent person in the village. Their understanding of intelligence is different from what we think intelligence in AI system. Their intelligence is rooted in holding the ethical base of a society and serving the community in nature. And ethics in a society goes beyond the individual benefit of that particular person, for example, fixing their physical pain, but it kind of encapsulates the well-being of the whole society. So moving the benefit from a single person to the society is also part of being intelligent. The second story that I'm going to tell is coming from data representation or visualization. For this, we turn to another important aspect of rural ethics in Bangladesh that sets it apart from some common practices of data visualization in computer science and AI. We focus on the visual art practices in rural Bangladesh, and through this, we see how the ethics in handling data is different in rural Bangladesh from that in Western scientific communities. In the modern visualization practice, the meaning of data is encoded in the presentation is not affected by the medium. For example, in the images on the right side of the slide, we see snapshots of the same visualization dashboard in 2 different media. One on the top is the user is watching a visualization opened in their browser. In the bottom one, another user is watching the same visualization on their mobile phone. And both of these users are expected to arrive at the same understanding of the information. The users also do not know who created the visualization and who created the data. Here, we would like to know 2 characteristics of this modern data visualization practices. Data is not connected to the particular material, and data is not connected to the people who created the data. Hence, the practice of data collection and visualization does not have an ethical accountability to the people who are affected by them. This is where the traditional data visualization practices are different. Let's now see 2 kinds of visual art practices in rural Bangladesh to explain these differences. First, the design of Nakshita. This is a type of embroidered quilt. Nakshita is a century-old art tradition in Bengal region. The basic materials used there are thread and old cloth. The beautiful patterns of the design that are embroidered resulted in the name of Nakshita, which basically means it is derived from the Bengali word naksha, which refers to artistic patterns. Nakshita often comes with a theme. Such themes include mythological stories, renowned local history, and religious events. The type of stitches, motifs, and the sealing of the borders of a Nakshita have very situated meanings. The meanings and interpretation of motifs might change depending on where it was designed. So the location, the material, they're very important here. The second form of visual art that we studied are the Hindu idols or murti. It is a general form for an image, statue, or idol of a deity in Hindu culture. In Hindu temples, it is a symbolic icon. A murti in itself is not a god in Hinduism, but is a shape or embodiment or manifestation of a deity. A murti is typically made by carving stone, wood, or metal casting, or more commonly through pottery. Ancient era texts describing their proper proportion, positions, and gestures. Making idols is a strictly caste-based profession, so not everyone can, it's not a matter of like only knowing how to build it. It's also connected to the caste who can actually build this. Ideally, the Pal families practice this craftsmanship and generally train their male children for years at home to build these murtis. Now, we will highlight some of the distinct features of these two forms of visual arts in rural Bangladesh that will distinguish them from the modern data visualization practices. One key element of communicating data in modern science, both digitally and in analog form, is the use of abstract marks like points, lines, bars, cards, and squares. In some cases, single marks can represent collections or even entire data set. For example, a single bar can represent the number of people in one graph, amount of annual income in another graph, and frequency of rains in a different other graphs. However, that is really the case for rural visualization practices. The visual designers we studied used the representation that were as close as possible to the meaning they intended to convey, avoiding high degree of abstraction. For example, goddess Lakshmi, as we can see in the picture, carries a lot full of wealth. Generally, the idol makers portray a pot of money to show that. When we ask them if it is possible to replace that pot of money with another mundane object and convey the same message, which could be, a paper money or a bank check, for example, the maker in our focus group discussion laughed at us with this idea, and he explained to us that the pot is not only about money or cash flow, it is about the wealth that will come and sustain, like the way the pot holds the wealth in it, ensuring the sustainability. Bank checks might just fly away. Thus, the materiality and the concreteness of data is very important there. Second, the digital media often focuses on scalability and reproducibility. Thus, the conventions are almost universal among users of digital systems. This is why for a modern visualization practice, it is often unimportant to know about the artist and their perspective. The artist often has very little to say, and in some cases, making the artist invisible means a better visualization. However, this is not true in rural visualization practices in Bangladesh, where it is very important to know about the artist and their perspective to understand the visual art. For example, the Nakshita that we see in this slide contains a year's worth of significant events as experienced by a housewife. The participant informed us that the year would look different in someone else's Nakshita, since the relative significance of the events, shape, and size of the objects and design sensibility would vary from person to person, she said. Thus, in rural visualization practices, data cannot be separated from the story, and the story cannot be separated from the storyteller. So in summary, in rural Bangladesh, working with data makes one accountable to their history and culture and nature. Data cannot be separated from materials and social context. Thus, for the rural people in Bangladesh, ethics in data is embedded in holding their communal identity and moral values. It is deeply situated in the local material culture. These values set it apart from its modern Western counterpart, where data is often considered as extractable product, often alienated from the context. Finally, we turn to the question of hope and luck. For this, we investigate the betting practices of rural Bangladesh. Sports betting is the activity of predicting sports results and placing a wager on the outcome. In rural Bangladesh, it is very common to find villagers betting on sports like cricket and football, or betting on the sports that they play themselves. The amount of wager varies from a small amount of money to vegetables. In this study, we try to understand how the villagers take their decision on which side they should bet on. In other words, how do they decide on their plan? In modern scientific worlds, statistics is widely used to make prediction in a game, and people often use different software for such predictions. For example, in the game of football, prediction software often considers the history of each of the teams, the recent performances of the players, the weather, the nature of the field, and the similar other historical data to predict which team have a better chance to win the match. In our fieldwork, we also found the villagers using different prediction software to see which team is predicted to win. However, we found that their final decision is often different from what their software is suggesting. This is where we found a clear difference between the modern scientific prediction and the traditional understanding of luck, and how the idea of hope in different is different in rural Bangladesh than that is in a modern scientific West. First, take a look at different forms of betting that are common in rural Jashore. We found 3 forms of betting practices there. One is kojeting, which means betting on games that is broadcasted on television. Dhorano, which means that betting over phone. In this case, the person is not watching the game themselves, but they are still participating in the betting through a third party. And Kauri, this is a more local form of betting, mostly played by women at their home. In all forms of betting, we found that the villagers relied less on statistical probability. Their decisions were mostly made by the cultural values that they hold. For example, they often label some people as inauspicious or kufa in local language. Their decision would often depend on the decision of those inauspicious people, meaning that they would always bet the opposite to what those people bet. Besides such superstitions, we also found that the decision was often shaped by their religious or national identities. This was evident when there was a cricket match between Pakistan and India. Since Pakistan is a Muslim majority country, we found that most Muslim villagers were betting for Pakistan, although the India team was much stronger and the prediction software was predicting a win for India. Similarly, when there was a cricket match between Bangladesh and another country, they would consider it unethical to bet against Bangladesh. We want to highlight here that their betting decisions were not only coming from an obligation to their country, religion, or culture, but they would also believe that their faith would make their supported team win. So here, their prediction of future was not shaped by the past data, but a hope for the future that is shaped by their ethical standpoint. Next, we would also they would also do different kinds of calculations for predicting the win that are different from how we calculate or how we predict through software system and AI. For example, if some of them failed in 3 consecutive cases while betting for a team that they are ethically right to support, they believe that they are surely going to win the 4th time. And this is kind of like a very interesting and important difference from how we think about probability in AI. Important to note here is that negative outcomes does not discourage them to adopt similar strategy in the future. Instead, they become even more hopeful. The more they lose, the closer they think they are to a win. This is quite different from what we find in many data-driven systems, where consecutive failures often mean a change in the strategy. Such predictions are hard to explain using modern scientific rationales, but they are very common in rural Jashore. I'm skipping this example. So as we can see, there are fundamental differences between Western notion of hope and rural traditional understanding of hope in Bangladesh. Hope in rural Bangladesh is not created by past data or empirical evidence, but from an ethical standpoint. Secondly, modern scientific data-driven models seldom involve cultural values that are hard to quantify, and they function poorly in the global south, where the ethics of hope here relies on luck, which is hard to calculate using the statistical mechanism. The statistics can give you probability, but luck is something which ultimately controls the outcome. So this is where faith and ethics become important here, because these people try to control their luck by pleasing their God, which is like a totally different approach than how people in modern scientific world, they more focus on increasing their probability, not increasing their luck. As we can see, the intelligence in traditional Bangladeshi communities can be defined by ethics, ecology, community value, hope, and identity. This set of qualities is quite different from the modern Western definition of intelligence, which stands on the scientific rationality, generalizability, probability, secularism, and empiricism. So ethics is not one kind of intelligence in traditional Bangladesh, but ethics is an essential element in any intelligence there. Any action, if that is not aligned with their local values, will not be considered as intelligence there. Now let's go back to our original question, whose ethics, or who defines what is good and what is bad? As we could see in our project with witchcraft, modern scientific approaches are not universally practiced and appreciated. In today's world, while the majority of the Western world appreciates the modern scientific understanding of health and well-being, many other places in the world have different other perspectives. Traditional healing, witchcraft, sorcery, and occult practices are still prevalent in many places in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Millions of people in these places depend on these faith-based practices and their health and for their health and well-being. This particular issue is also connected to the colonial history of science and technology. For example, across the history of colonization and cultural imperialism, traditional medical practices were ignored, sidelined, or suppressed, which contributed to the development, expansion, and proliferation of many European scientific practices through building scientific knowledge bases, which later formed a hegemony in medical science, in physics, in chemistry. With the burgeoning growth in computing in the last 2 decades, mobile phones and other computing devices have become ubiquitous, and many computer scientists are taking the advantages of these technologies to extend this colonial knowledge in the global South, which brings back the various post-colonial, decolonial debates around modernity and tradition, efficiency and identity, and science and spirituality. We also saw the creation, collection, and use of data have a long ethical implication in the traditional societies, and they cannot be thought without considering the history and identity of the people in those communities. Our study on traditional data visualization practices shows how the rural Bangladeshi communities have long and rich tradition of storing and communicating information that are strongly connected to the local art and material culture. We thus show how the local practices are fundamentally different from a modern scientific practice that risks alienating data from materials, designers, and context. We argue that having more knowledge about people's lives through long-term ethnographic engagement and participatory studies will lead to more effective information communication technologies for this and similar other marginalized populations. Further, our study on dating practices showed that there are fundamental differences between the Western notion of rationality and rural traditional rationality in Bangladesh. Western scientific rationality is mostly individualistic and secular, which leaves little space for faith-based understanding of hope. Also, the traditional concept of luck is different from probability as defined in literature of data science and data-driven decision-making. While there is a trend in AI and machine learning and smart technology supported world to quantify and predict the future, for many people living in the traditional societies in the global South, future is largely dependent on their luck. Instead of counting the past for predicting their future, people believe that their future is controlled by a supernatural power, often that is God, hence increasing their chance to win the luck. Instead of following the data-driven suggestions, they focus more on pleasing their gods. This divide in understanding the future points out the gap in human AI scholarship in designing for the faith-based communities, especially in the global South. So we argue that to strengthen the voice of local communities in the non-Western societies, the current models of AI are not sufficient. The discussion on ethics in AI should not only be centered on Western notions of ethics. We should get rid of universal and generalized forms of intelligence, and localized and situated ethical practices should consider local faith-based practices, stories, and hopes. So in order to have the voice of the marginalized groups in and over computing platforms, we need to make sure that they have easy and equal access to computing. They have necessary autonomy and freedom to express their rightful concerns, and their voice is not suppressed by imposing a foreign standards of ethics. So building on my framework of voice, my team and I are now working on a few projects to support and strengthen the voice of marginalized communities. One of these projects is in ethics in AI, which I'm also like conducting in support of SRI. And in this project, we are focusing on 4 research questions here. How does AI ethics look in a non-Western culture? How can we make AI justifiable by local values and accountable to local communities? The main field sites for this project are in rural Bangladesh, and we are particularly focusing on faith-based traditional communities there. So I want to, while I'm working in this project, I want to thank all the funding agencies and institutions for supporting our work. They include INSARC, CIHR, SHARC, NIH, Google, SRI, Microsoft Research, Samsung, University of Toronto, and Cornell University. I also want to thank all my colleagues and collaborators who have been helping me advance this project forward. This is the picture of my group, Third Space, and University of Toronto. And here are only the names of a few of them. There are many more, and definitely I couldn't find the space to bring all of their names here, but I thank them all. And thank you all for patiently hearing my talk. I'd be delighted to hear your feedback, comments, and questions now. Also, feel free to reach out to me at this email address if you have more thoughts to share with me.
Thank you, Ishtiaque. That was terrific. Really, so intriguing. Can you take your slides down so we can see all our faces, and as many people who are comfortable turning on your cameras, please do, so we can get to know each other. And we are open for questions. I'm going to give people a moment, Ishtiaque. It always takes people to get their energy going, but I have one to get you started. So I was trying to think about the 2 messages I sort of hear about AI. One was build AI that is responsive to local communities, local values, ethical pluralism. But there also seemed to be a message that, and maybe this is a question for you as a computer scientist, to the extent that building AI is built on abstractions and that kind of rationality, is that possible? So there was a part of it that sounded like, don't bring your AI here because it's built on, and it's a colonizing effort. I mean, can you build AI without data abstraction? Can you build it? So let me stop there.
Absolutely. No, that's actually a very good question. Like here is where this gets complicated, because on one hand, one of the ethical standpoints of AI says that it is different from broad theories because it is built on empirical evidences. But on the other hand, as AI is implemented through this computing system, it inevitably depends on abstraction. And if we look at the history, this kind of abstraction was actually built the problem of global generalized theorization, which from the decolonial perspective is a big problem, that someone builds a generalized theory somewhere by all this abstraction and then tries to impose those theories on everyone around the world. So now as you very nicely defined this the tension, where we are finding that this abstraction, when it happens, it kind of sometimes problematically tries to datafy some situation or abstract a situation, tries to capture a problem that is actually not the way the local people feel about it, and the problem starts from there. Probably, so I'm not canceling all the options of now it's not possible here because we have not explored, but we believe that a different kind of artificial intelligence, or if we don't call it artificial, we can call it a different name, is possible, that coming from local people's ethics and intelligence. Thanks.
Okay, great. I'll look forward to exploring that with you. Question from Matt.
Hi, Matt.
Hi, Ishtiaque. How are you?
Good.
So I actually want to talk with you, ask you some questions about hope. I thought your perspectives on it were very interesting and quite divergent from the sort of Western idea about hope as predicated and based in history. But I actually wondered, you talked a little bit about the sort of way in which hope is constituted within these communities that you're studying. but what about the hope of the researchers themselves? And I wondered a little bit about the maybe a potential disconnect between the way you might think of their hope and the way they constitute hope, and then the way you constitute hope. And then maybe this speaks a little bit about what Jillian was saying as well, which is sort of like, this is my read on it, like, how do you balance the sort of perspectives of the researcher and where they're coming from and the perspectives and context of that you're trying to study, particularly if there is a major, and I think in some cases the context that you're studying has this, a major disconnect in perspective and values.
There is actually, like a major disconnect, but I feel, like so coming from, like a Bangladesh, I kind of like understand when I, work with my people, my community, that, the sort of like a hope is not defined by, like a major theories or like driven by all this like capitalist stuff. We understand hope more as, embedded in how people feel hope, like they experience their life and how it's shaped by that. It doesn't come with any idea of progress. It doesn't come with any idea of like what we call like this vertical hope, from religion, or even like the horizontal hope of, like this Western pragmatism. It's kind of, like it challenges both in a way, but, I wouldn't say it challenges, it negotiates. And this is the point where I'm trying to make in responding to your question. So the point where I'm learning from the community is how they negotiate different tensions around hope, because we don't want to romanticize this communities either. This communities in Bangladesh, it has like an historical struggle with different people. They know that this is happening, and they have built their own resistance to how to negotiate with these kinds of tensions. So there, I'm trying to understand their negotiation, and that is probably the way to understand the hope better, instead of like what's their hope. It will be, and it also kind of like involve this us versus them thing, which is not at the end of the day very fruitful. But it's more to understand here is how different forms of negotiation are happening through their material practices there, where they are handling on one hand this Western pragmatism, but on the other hand their local traditional understanding of the world. So for me, it's a learning project.
Great. Ishtiaque, you may know that there are some in the existential risk community who have urged people to start thinking about existential hope as well. And I'm okay. We have some questions building up in the chat, which is great. I'm trying to keep track of when they come in relative to hands that I see going up. I'm going to go to the 3 that I see now, and then I'll go to some questions from the chat. Kristen.
Hey, Ishtiaque, nice to see you. And it was so lovely to get an overview of all of your projects. Yeah, thank you so much. I really loved how you said very articulately, data cannot be separated from story, and story cannot be separated from the storyteller. I think this is a really critical standpoint and intervention to AI, where, regardless of what proponents of big data insist, context is vital, and without it, ethics are very tenuous. And so from our conversations, I know that we share like a mutual frustration regarding computing's historical insistence on its secularity, its scientific rationality and objectivity, and that we've had some great conversations, that those things are by design and necessity, and ultimately in service to colonialism, settler colonialism, white supremacy, etc., and that these ignore and refuse non-Western culture, community, place-based expertise. And so I'm, always in deep admiration of all the ways in which you premise and activate place-based expertise in all of your various projects. And I know that you gave a shout out to Lily Irani and Ruha Benjamin, but I was wondering if you might share with all of us either some like formative texts or some really new and exciting texts that might help others who are interested in actualizing place-based and community-led research.
Oh, thank you, and absolutely. Like, thanks for all your kind words. I'm still learning, so I'm not the person who can, I'm also like a, one of the challenges here is that oftentimes when this criticism of AI, this literature emerges, we learned a lot from them, like Ruha's work and Virginia Eubanks, and we're agreeing with all of them that there are shared frustrations and all of this, but we are also seeing that we have more to tell here which are not here, and definitely some stories that are coming from different places, people in the indigenous communities, people in LGBT communities, people in traditional faith-based communities. When we're reading from them, we see a further deprivations, further marginalizations that are happening here. Instead of suggesting reading, I would say that we are starting, we have started a new reading group so that we all can read together and learn more and share our knowledge. So
that was a bit of an intro to that, yeah.
See, just thank you for making the way for that. So so we are thinking we are starting a new reading group where I will also send the invite to you all, where we will share our knowledge and try to find out a way how we can think about a decolonized environment with computing. It's a difficult task. Some scholars have said that it's impossible. We do not disagree with any of us, but let's see what we can learn from it and what we can do about this.
Great, and we'll be sure to make available the information about how to find your discussion group. Wonderful, Jason.
Yes, Ishtiaque, fascinating stuff. I've learned so much from this. So you did a really excellent job of kind of articulating some of the barriers that some of these traditional communities face in terms of the adoption of technology. But the one example that you gave, I'm having the hardest time kind of understanding is the one with the witches and the witchcraft, right? So what do you conclude, as an engineer from your findings? I mean, the best I could come up with is maybe it might be possible, to do something like what Matt has done with a mental health chatbot, right? Maybe have a witch chatbot. And if you're not able to go visit your local witch for whatever reason, there's an app on your phone and it'll ask you the kind of questions that a witch would ask. But maybe that's too simplistic. I don't know. But what are you concluding from that?
That's a great question, Jason. Thanks for asking this. To be honest, when I was starting this witchcraft practices, I wasn't wearing my engineering hat, and I didn't go to the field for building something or changing whatever they're doing. But there are one thing that I learned from the community that I think is important, which is how they are juxtaposing their faith with this scientific practices. So their medical hospitals are still there, and the witches are when they see that a person needs medical attention, they are recommending them for going for medical hospitals. But what they're doing is something else. They are also asking this question, well, yes, you have this bad physical condition, but why have you got that? So, you fell from a tree and then you broke your legs. That's one explanation, but why did that happen to you? And this kind of a question is kind of, connected to their faith. And, they then try to explain this, probably you have done something wrong. And that's why, this is a punishment, which is still a smaller version of what you could, get after your death. So you should take this positively. And on the other hand, you shouldn't do this kind of things later. So what they are also trying to do is to, minimize or reduce the, bad practices in the society. So that is the kind of work where they kind of combine the physical and moral things together. Is something which I found fascinating, and I think there, when in many scientific practices or engineering practices, you may say we very much alienate these two things, and which becomes problematic. And the way the witches were integrating these two were fascinating to me. And here we need to also keep in mind there's this witches in rural Bangladesh where, witchcraft is not believed by, like the scientists for sure, but not also believed by the big religions there too. Like Islam does not believe in it, Hinduism, they do not believe in it. So they were still there, and they were kind of like making these arrangements so that the society can, still hold both of them. And this is also the, another example of negotiation that we are trying to learn from them.
I see. So you weren't approaching that work with the intent of trying to think about how to design some technology that would interface with those beliefs.
It's kind of like a other way around. I was trying to learn things from them so that I can use that knowledge in other fields.
I see. Okay, thanks. That clears things up. Thanks.
Can I just follow up on that a little bit, Ishtiaque? Because I was thinking about, the way in which agency and this individualistic notions about agency and contracting are forming a big part of how sort of emerging regulatory regimes and standards for platforms, data use, and so on. That's a strong thread through, and that's actually also sort of some of the ethical critique that you're pointing to as kind of, the dominant ethical critique is also often looking towards agency and individualism. And so I guess I'm wondering, I think I'm very taken by the Facebook example, and the Muslim subject that you spoke with, who said, well, I don't know if I was, I may see something I shouldn't see. So, could we be thinking about how we design our, platforms, not for agency, because that's actually, but rather for the role of intermediaries, whether it's the spiritual intermediary like the witch or like an imam. Anyway, it just got me thinking about agency, because I see so much of that as like, the way we will solve this is you'll have the right to take your data out, you'll have the right to control your recommendations, and we maybe need to think about different solutions. If we're talking about scale, right, you have to not be thinking about the village level, but rather at the, at the country level that's then getting played out in the village.
Yeah, absolutely right. And it also involves the trust question there. So it's not that they're uncomfortable with a third party deciding for them what they should see. They do not see the third party here. So Facebook, it's kind of like, who is the person who is showing me these things? This is where they are being suspicious, and how can they trust someone? And it's clearly they know that this person is not from their community. So maybe AI algorithm and Facebook is smart enough, they would only be showing them things that they would appreciate, but how do they trust them? So
wonderful. And Nick, I'll be right to you in a sec, but I do want to ask Sharifa, who I know has joined us today and is doing some of this work, I believe, on the witches, if she would like to contribute her thinking at this point. I did give her warning, by the way, in the chat that I was going to do this.
Sharifa, are you with us?
Hi, Ishtiaque. Hi, Jillian. Yes, I'm here. I'm enjoying this Q&A session. I really enjoyed your presentation too, Ishtiaque. Nice work. Thanks for presenting it.
Sport work.
I mean, we did it together, so it came out really good. So I wasn't sure what am I exactly going to answer, which question. Could you please, any of you, repeat it for me so that I can?
I guess like Gideon was wondering if you want to add something to this ongoing discussion about what we can learn from the witches that you are so close to it.
Absolutely. I really loved Jason's question about like how we can like integrate the learning from our witchcraft study and merge it to traditional computing / designing computing technology. But I think one thing we could do is that from witchcraft study, we learn how to have completely different ideas, which are like totally polar opposite, put them together under the same umbrella, so that both of the idea coexist together. And this is really needed for a tolerant society. Like if you look at the internet, all this rumor, hate speech, harassment, and even misinformation, for example, all of this happening because many people actually hate each other's ideas. So how can we be more respectful? How can we be more tolerant to people who have like other ideas and not be hostile and stay in the same space when nobody has to compromise, or maybe we can come up with some minimum compromisation and stay all together and have a tolerant internet space? Could be a good learning, could borrow the lessons from witchcraft study, where witchcraft practice, as Ishtiaque mentioned, were often bringing knowledges from Muslim communities, Muslim practices, Hindu practices, traditional rural Bangladeshi other practices, and having all the people from many different communities as their clients and like contributing to social harmony. If you go to our audience here, go to the paper, we literally said how they were literally contributing to social harmony through their practices. So this for a tolerant society, or more like tolerant internet practices, we can actually learn from this study. That is what I wanted to add to Ishtiaque's answer. Already Ishtiaque's answer was mind-blowing. I was convinced, but this is what I wanted to add. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Sharifa. Very glad you were able to join us today. I'm going to go to Nick.
Thank you. Not putting my camera on. Lovely to see you. Lovely to see your work. It means so much to me hearing these titled works. I've been working in this area quite a long time, and it's lovely to see these things. I really appreciate your comments. I really appreciate your last comments, Sharifa, about tolerance, respect and harmony. That was really well put. So that's fantastic. So my question is going to be really tough. There is no right answer, but I'm sure you've been wrangling with it just as much as I have over the past few years. So it's about the post-colonial systemic issues. And if you like, the ethics of attending to responding to local ethics. And what I mean here is, whose voice is playing into the geopolitics of technology, and how do we reconcile this? If we took an example, we know AI is producing more carbons than it's probably helping in terms of resilient societies. And most of the people who are taking the hit of climate change at the moment are the most marginalized people. They are the people who will be exposed in Africa or in Asia to drought and extreme weather and so on. So how do we balance the contents of producing those technologies when we know at the moment we haven't really quite got it sorted out that they're not making things worse? I could give a bit of a historical metaphor. So early Christian missionary exercises in Africa introduced the Bible to Africa very, very successfully by translating it, responding to local ethics, supporting syncretic practices, and in some ways, speaking into hope, speaking into those sorts of things. I don't want us to have a conversation about the value of Christianity to Africa, but one could also say that kind of a technique, a technology of the Bible, of the story, we might see something similar happening in ethically sensitive AI too. So how do we deal with that, right? Do you understand my question? How we deal with the bigger picture?
Question.
Yeah.
It's a big question and I don't have the answer. I just know that this is a big challenge, and as you say, like computing AI, they have now become the new vehicle of this pushing this ethics in this global South context and post-colonial context, and this has been problematic, and this has been a point of contention at like various levels. In many countries, global South countries, that development is a big thing, and development is being done by this Western donors, and many of them are now they want to see computing there. Computing is analogous to development. Computing, they want to see all this, like AI sort of stuff there. And as you said, very few of them actually are asking this question, like, what's the backstory of this? And this is like and on one hand, you cannot just say that you can stand out and like refuse everything. That is not also going to help the local people. It'll be bad. But then on the other hand, you also want us, like as you say, like a very broad geopolitical systemic change for everyone to realize this. And I do not know how to respond to this question. This is a big, when I'm in the field and anyone like we realize that how big a problem this is. And it's definitely not a like a problem that could be solved by designing a technology or two. All I can say is that a very big systemic level change is required here. But we need to voice this. We need to need more people to talk about this.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks, Ishtiaque.
Thanks, Nick.
So I'm gonna read Ushnisi's question.
So Jillian, sorry for interrupting. Can I take a second to also give a shout out to my other PhD student, Rifat? Yes. So he is a PhD student of computer science department, and I also cited his work here. He's here. Rifat, do you want to? So Rifat has been studying the Muslim community, practicing Muslim communities in Bangladesh and their use of computing technology, their understanding of like a open computing. So Rifat, do you want to add a couple of words to that?
Oh yeah, thank you. So yes, Ishtiaque mentioned I'm a PhD student in computer science. I also am doing a doctoral specialization in South Asian studies. So a lot of things that we learn is about feminism, post-colonialism, decolonialism, etc., that are coming from South Asian politics and moralities and ethics. And my research in human-computer interaction is about faith in computing. So more particularly, what I try to do is I try to understand the rationality and politics that are related to technology and that are coming from the faith-based and spiritual communities, especially in the global South. But I'm also recently extending my research in the Western world as well. And in another direction of my research, particularly in my PhD, I'm trying to design and develop technologies to increase interfaith communication and mitigate the faith-based violences like Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, etc. So yeah, that's briefly about myself and my research.
Thanks.
And thank you for organizing this. I'm attending the lectures and everything from SRI, and this is really like a comforting place to hear from the people who are like-minded and who are doing fantastic work all over the campus and beyond the campus. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Rifat, and thanks for telling us about your work and for being in the conversation and community here. I also want to add sort of, when we're thinking about the impact of AI and the economic potential of AI and thinking, globally, and then you say, well, what does that mean? How do we evaluate that if, huge shares of the population of the globe, for example, if it would be unethical to deploy AI to coordinate climate change responses, to rework economic systems, to create platforms, to create trading platforms. I think when we're ambitious about the potential for AI globally, we think about the capacity to raise people out of poverty, but 4 billion people around the world live on less than $10 a day, and the relationships with the things that you're raising, Ishtiaque, I think are really compelling, and Rifat and Sharifa in your work as well on this, very, very compelling in that so what's the future of that if you're treading all over people's ways of thinking, ways of being, ways of relating to the world. Anyway, really, really important. Let me get back to Ushnisi's question. His question is part of the neocolonial AI development process, not only extraction of data, but extraction of valuable human resources. like the brain drain of scientists and engineers from Bangladesh and the global south, which we see a little bit on this on our screen here. How would we counter this massive movement of labor? I think that's a real challenging question.
Yeah, no, definitely. So one of the ways that we, we can see this colonization that's been happening through AI is kind of analogous to the classical land grabbing colonization. So instead of land grabbing, where one of the things that's happening with current AI is data grabbing. So kind of like making the people in the global south or in other marginalized communities as the subject of data, or where you can extract the data from, or whose data can be freely grabbed if you have enough computational muscles. You have all the supercomputers, all the sensors, and all this engineers. If you're like Google, you can, or Facebook, you can grab a lot of data from marginalized population. So that's like a classical way of how this neo-colonial, a version of AI is happening. And now if you look at this infrastructure, there is definitely labor involved. And this labor is again coming from this colonial chain. A lot of engineers, a lot of people who are working in this AI field, they are also coming from the global south. And this is nothing different from the old colonial, profit-making cycle, where they would make the colonized people work for producing, resources that they would use, and the colonizers would use. So we all are kind of, a victim of the same system. And also there is another part involved there that Nick said, the materials, that are being burned for making these AI systems. Those are also often, collected from, or resourced from this colonized places. So the whole system is that the way to look at it is that how we all are kind of directly or indirectly are victims of this. We definitely have our own, we cannot deny that we are not also indirectly participating in making that happen. We could definitely do better in this process. But I think this idea is not often clear, even, and it's not coming to literature that much. And especially it's a blind spot for many computer scientists who are actually doing this. Still, ethics is a thing that computer scientists think that that's not like their thing. They're philosophy people will be talking about this, law people will be talking about this. We are computer scientists, we just go and build stuff. And that's fundamentally, a problematic here.
Yeah, no, I very much appreciate that point, and it is part of what we're trying to drive in the community as well. That it's an interdisciplinary conversation that we're all engaged in. I wanted to ask a question. Ron Becker, I'm not sure if you're still with us. I think he may have had to drop from the call. Ron, if you're here, maybe not. But I wanted to pull out his question just as in our last few minutes about. Have you done any work with Indigenous people in Canada? And if so, how are things similar or different from rural Bangladesh? And I have a sense that then there's maybe something in the works here.
So I have many friends in Indigenous scholars community, and I try to collaborate with them, learn from them. But one thing that we need to understand here is that if I go, in an Indigenous communities and, start, it's another version of what we are against, what we are opposed to this kind of idea. What we can do is definitely build a collaboration, learn from each other, share knowledge with them. And if they want, any help from us that, from the knowledge that I am bringing from my community, if that is helpful for them, that we can offer. But this whole idea of this transferable generalized knowledge is something that we are challenging. And this is where I see this as more of a space of collaboration and knowledge sharing, which is absolutely, a good thing, but not doing this traditional research on Indigenous communities or any communities, I would say, that I'm not a part of.
Right, okay. Let's see. I had another, if there's not another hand coming up, I had a question also in here from Nazwa. Are you still with us, Nazwa?
Hello, yeah, I'm here.
Did you want to ask a question or a question? You had a couple in the chat there.
Yeah, I was wondering if you know, the curriculum, I find that in many ways, not just computer sciences, but also environmental sciences and other stuffs, the curriculums are very colonial in nature, which really disables us from helping our communities when we are going into real life and doing projects with them. Another thing is with colonialism and that brain drain everyone was talking about. A big problem here, I think, that is that we are pushed towards global north to gain knowledge, because during the colonial period, not only was our knowledge, say our nurture of knowledge was paused, but also it was destroyed. So there is this vacuum that we cannot really retrieve. So I guess that also kind of pushes us in a way to go back to these global north places and gain knowledge, and then come here and then find ways to adapt that colonialized knowledge and see how to use it here. So it gets a very complicated process and really time consuming. But the thing is, as an environmental scientist, I find it whether we have time, especially regarding climate change, to do all of these adjustments when things are rapidly changing now. Yeah,
Thank you,
that
Nazwa.
was my question.
Absolutely, it's a fantastic question, and thank you. And it's 3:30 a.m. in Bangladesh, and thanks for joining us from Bangladesh this time. So the colonization and curriculum is a big issue. I think Cheyenne also mentioned that in the chat. It's absolutely it's a very disturbing problem that we have seen happening almost all over the world. Our curriculum, our syllabus, what we are learning, these are colonized. They don't talk about this decolonizing stuff there. We need more education there, more research, more voices from communities who are being marginalized, who are being colonized here. So data colonization is one thing. And about this, a brain drain thing, I guess you were right, how the knowledge is now accumulated in some Western universities, and now we have to come to the Western world to learn the things that we could learn. This definitely is an additional, headache, additional time and energy that's been added to the lives of the the post-colonial subjects. We are trying to get rid of all this online platforms. They come with this hope that we should not do this. We will overcome this challenge. We're still not there, and what we are seeing with this online education is sometimes what's happening opposite. They're spreading this colonizing knowledge instead. So there is a lot to do here, and not many people are working on this. Is the one frustration that I can probably voice out. But definitely you have asked some questions that we all are concerned of, and we all value that we need to do something with this. And yeah, it's a long way of saying this is I do not know how to make things better.
Me neither, but I think we can definitely collaborate. Especially, I think knowledge has become very segregated these days, and I think there is need for more interdisciplinary or maybe transdisciplinary research on this regard to actually find solutions before it's too late.
Absolutely.
But yeah, thanks so much for giving me the floor.
I think that speaks to what we're trying to do, and thank you, Ishtiaque, for a wonderful talk and for bringing us together on across all these dimensions for thinking about reflecting on the work and the future of the research agenda. Thanks everybody for joining us. We have a talk next week from Taylor Owen, who's an associate professor in the Max Bell School of Public Policy at McGill University, on evaluating the state of the platform governance agenda. So maybe we can carry some of these ideas into that seminar as well. Jack has popped a survey into the chat. If you have a chance to give us some feedback on the process here, we'd be very grateful. thanks again for joining us, and we hope to see you all next week as well. Thanks. Thanks, Ishtiaque. Really appreciate it. Bye, everyone.